Welcome again to MIT Sloan Alumni Online. On the program, we have Professor Arnold Barnett, PhD, class of 1973, and the George Eastman Professor of Management Science and Professor of Statistics here at MIT Sloan. And Jacqueline Selby of the EMBA class of 2021 will be our moderator for today. We're here to discuss the U.S. political system, as well as standards and biases in polling methodology. Of course, this is a timely topic as we approach the general election in the United States in November. So we appreciate Arnie being with us to share his expertise and research on what's going on in the world today. So Arnie will go through a presentation to set the stage, and then we'll move into a Q&A with our audience, and we welcome you to submit questions via the Q&A feature in your Zoom interface. As we are getting underway, Arnie, Jackie, thank you so much. We appreciate you being with us today. I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Greg, and a special thank you to the External Relations Office for your continued partnership on the series, and thank you all for attending and joining us today. Arnie is an expert in statistics and probability with a particular focus on public health and safety and just the overall well-being in society. He's written extensively about polling, the trustworthiness of polls, and their impact on election outcomes. And with 13 days leading into the US presidential election, we could not be happier to have him with us today to shed light on these exact topics. As we prepared for today's session, it has been fascinating to learn from Arnie and really a privilege to have him here with us today, as Greg mentioned, especially in light of the timely nature of this session. So Arnie, thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule to share your insights with our alumni.
Oh, it's an enormous pleasure to join the alumni on this occasion.
So Arnie, before we move into your presentation, would you like to share a couple of brief words about your background that kind of inform today's discussion?
I think you've already done that. I mean, I'm an applied statistician. I've always been interested in statistical sampling because after all is said and done, almost all statistics problems turn out to be sampling problems in the end. And polling is probably the application of statistical sampling that's most widely known in the public. And people have heard about polling results and margins of error. In other domains in which statistics is used, it just doesn't have the same prominence. So there's obviously an interest in polls, and particularly given that they concern questions we care a lot about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you. Well, I will turn it over to you to share the presentation that you have put together for us today.
Okay, well, Greg will be arranging the slides, so I'll try to keep up with him. Anyway, we could talk in general terms about polling and methodologies and abstruse details about whether homoscedasticity and the regression used in polling work. But I think deep down inside, what we're interested in now is, well, who's going to win? I gave a talk to the alumni back in 2020 about the forthcoming election, just about this time, about 2 weeks before. And I remember estimating that Joe Biden had a 97.7% chance of winning. In retrospect, that number sounds a little high to me. I might add a lot of people at the talk seemed delighted by the result. If some of those same people are on this talk, I'm not sure they will be equally delighted as we go through the more recent numbers. Okay, let's go back though to 2020 because it has a lot to do with what's going on now. First of all, back in 2020, there was lots of frustration about the failure of the polls in the election, which did lead, of course, to President Biden's win. Former Secretary of State Baker declared this time we were promised the pollsters would get it right. Well, they didn't. The next one, please. Then there was the New York Times ran an article, 2016, Delta blow to polling, did 2020 kill it? A commentator in Yahoo Finance said the biggest election takeaway is the absolute massive failure of polling. Next slide, please. And this is important. The American Association for Public Opinion Research had a very extensive review of what happened and said, actually, in 2020, the polls did worse than in 2016. Even though in 2016 there was great surprise that Hillary Clinton didn't win, in 2020 the person predicted to win, namely Biden, did win. But even so, they said if you actually look at the errors that were suffered, 2020 was a worse year than 2016. Now, next, please. It seemed to me these comments might be overwrought because you have to remember we have the individual polls that were taken, a poll in Wichita, Kansas. But what about a sophisticated aggregator like Nate Silver? Here's someone who takes individual polling results and aggregates them. If he knows a poll systematically favors Republican candidates, he makes an adjustment for it. He gives greater weight to the polls that have historically been accurate than those that are not. He considers all kinds of correlations. Anyway, if a person with this sophistication can use these materials and get a good forecast, you could say they were raw materials in a process that ultimately was highly successful. And in that sense, we didn't fail. So I worked with a student of mine. We have a new program, Masters for Business Analytics at the Sloan School. And I had a student who is French, actually. And explaining the US political system to him was not that easy because the French are logical. But in any case, I said, why don't we see how well 538 did as a guide to whether the polls really failed? And we basically went through the results and found, look, 538 did an absolutely excellent job in predicting state by state winners. In the critical swing states, though, it systematically underestimated Trump's vote share by about 2 percentage points. If they said he would get 48, he might get 50, let's say. I think overall that's pretty impressive because you have to remember 2020 was at the height of the pandemic that had arisen. The question was how many people would actually be willing to go to the polls, given the risks associated with coming down with COVID. There were lots of new ways of voting associated with box drop-offs, with mail-in ballots, etc. And also, it was just harder for the pollsters to get through because people were not opening the door to strangers in the midst of the pandemic. So, with all those things at hand, getting it right to within 2 percentage points struck me as very good. But then the next slide, we said, let's see how much of that is due to 538's secret sauce, and how much of it was due to the fact that the polls that it processed had already done very well. One thing we did was look at real clear politics, and I'll be talking about it later today. And you could not imagine a simpler way of synthesizing polling results. They simply take all the reputable polls in the last 2 or 3 weeks, average their outcomes together, and that's what they tell us is happening. They don't make any attempt to adjust for biases or correlations or anything like that. They just take the simple average. So we said, how much better did 538 do with all of its sophisticated machinery? And the next slide, please, tells us, quite perhaps surprisingly, is that 538 did just as well. I mean, Real Clear Politics did just as well as 538. It was also short by about 2 percentage points in the state-specific vote shares. So basically, this simple method, it turned out, really did just as well in depicting what actually happened as the more elaborate one. And then the next slide, though, tells us, what about the individual polls? You know, if we have 20 polls, 10 of them overestimate Trump's vote share by 8 points, and the other 10 underestimate by 8 points. Well, the average error is 0, but the individual polls are all off by 8. Well, I said, well, what about before the averaging? How well were they doing? And they were doing very well. Their average error was about 2.5 percentage points, which is less than sampling noise alone would explain. The margin of error was typically 4. And they were a little bit low on average. How low? About 2 points. In other words, what happened was 2020, contrary to what was said, if we can go to the next one, please, really was a big success all around. The one common problem was this 2 point deficit relative to Trump's vote share. Anyway, that's sort of background. If we can continue, please. What happened was a postmortem occurred among the social scientists, and how did this happen? Why did we lose 2 points relative to Trump's actual vote share? And they couldn't come up with anything. The only thing they said was, well, maybe those who were willing to take part in the polls differed substantially from those who were not, that Trump supporters were more likely to refuse to take part. And by the way, that's a real issue. I hope I'm not talking too fast. I'm from New York City, so we talk very quickly. But what I'm saying is that only about 9% of those who are contacted by the pollsters and asked their presidential preferences are willing to tell them. And the question always is, how do the 9% who respond compare to the 91% who did not? And they simply said, well, we don't know. Maybe that's the problem. The point is, no one knew exactly why Trump's vote share was underestimated. Okay, next one, please. Now, we have another presidential election. Let's continue, please. And now I'll tell you, the pollsters have adopted new techniques to avoid underestimating Trump's statewide vote shares this year. Let me just very quickly tell you one that was described in the New York Times recently. Suppose you have a polling result, and one of the questions they asked was, for whom did you vote in the last election? And let's say you have a polling result where 56% said they voted for Biden, 44% for Trump, when in reality, the result was actually 52 for Biden, 48 for Trump. In other words, people were concealing a little bit their votes for Trump. What they would do, these pollsters, is reweight the data. So the 56% who said I was for Biden then only count as if they were 52 instead of 56. And the 44 who said they were for Trump now count as 48 instead of 44. In other words, it's basically a technique for kicking up Trump's vote share compared to the raw polling results. This is highly controversial. Some respected pollsters like New York Times Siena refuse to do it. But what I'm trying to say is experiments have taken place to avoid this deficit relative to Trump that occurred last time. Different pollsters are proceeding differently. That's a good thing, because then we can see whether those who process the data in a certain way are getting different results from those who process it differently. If we go on, please. Now, what about 2024? First, I want to turn to Nate Silver's Silver Bulletin. It used to be 538, but there was a jurisdictional dispute with Disney, so he left them the machinery of 538 and came up with something new, cleverly named Silver Bulletin. And they have been processing the 2024 results. And look, these people are good, okay? I must confess, even though it's a certain jealousy, but a certain admiration for Nate Silver and what he does. When they deal with polls, they think of everything that could possibly complicate matters, correlations across states, historical tendencies, the effect of, let's say, the convention, sort of the convention bounce, et cetera, that there's an artificial high, debate consequence, everything you could think of, and many other things, into some overall model of where we are now. So I think the place to start out is, what are they saying about things? And if we go to the next slide, now we have numbers. As of Saturday at noon, when I stopped looking at the polls so I could do this presentation, Silver Bulletin said that Trump was ahead. It gave him 51.2% for probability of winning versus 48.8 for Harris. More recently, by the way, as of this morning, it's actually now 53 to 47. So they envision a slight lead for Trump, not a wildly decisive one, but still putting everything together, they think the tea leaves more for Trump's brew than for Harris's, okay? For the next one, what about Real Clear Politics? I think we should talk about that because, first of all, it is transparent. It did just as well last time as did 538. And the Occam's razor principle in science says the simplest explanation that fits the data is really the one to use. Well, maybe by that premise, let's at least look at what they're saying. The first thing I'll tell you is, if you go to Real Clear Politics, it doesn't give you a probability that Trump will win as of now based on the data. However, it gives us the clues from which we can work out the probability. If we go to the next slide, please. First of all, I'm going to assume, as I think is very widely assumed now, is that the election outcome in 2 weeks will depend on what happens in these 7 states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. In other words, it's believed that Harris and Trump are pretty much neck and neck in the remaining states, but there's no uncertainty. Now, of course, that's not necessarily true. There's a possibility, for example, that California will go for Trump. However, if you're going to tell people, I think Trump is going to carry California, would you do me a favor? Say that you're from Harvard Business School, because no one from Sloan with our analytical minds will believe that Trump is going to carry California. So outside these states, it's pretty much assumed we know it's going to happen. In Massachusetts or Georgia, et cetera, we have that. So let's focus on these 7 states and what RCP is saying there, RCP being Real Clear Politics. I'd like to show you the actual data the RCP provides for the state of Arizona here. And you'll notice what happens. They basically took a period of about 3 weeks. They took all the reputable polls that had occurred then. They list the sample sizes of the polls, their purported margins of error, and they list the result, the Trump-Harris split. And they come up with a simple average of the results across polls, saying Trump was ahead, if you see on the right, by 1.4 percentage points. I think we should look at this chart for a moment before turning away. One thing I notice is how strikingly similar are the results of these 8 polls at different times using different methodologies. Look at the Harris column, how all the numbers range between 46 and 48. And similarly for Trump, a little bit higher than that over time. It really is impressive that they all seem to be pointing the same way. What RCP would do is to basically to create a mega poll, basically to take all of these data. We have about 7,000 data points and throw them into one big stew and then say, out of the 7,000, what percentage are for Trump, what for Harris? Let's treat that as the sampling result and work out probabilities. So this is something I think we should bear in mind. I'd also like you to look at CBS News, go across that one. Notice it says Trump 51 and Harris 48. With using our special skills, we know that sums up to 99. And that's something that I clicked on and realized the number of undecided voters, people who say, I haven't decided, is extremely low. When it falls below 100%, when we add up the 2 numbers, typically is because of the third-party candidates, Cornel West and what is that woman's, not Gertrude Stein, but some Stein woman, actually. They get the rest. In most elections 2 weeks before, maybe 6 or 8% say, I haven't decided. This time, everyone seems to be saying, I've decided one way or the other. Anyway, if we continue, I'll just tell you, one of the interesting things about polling is it not only gives you an estimate and a margin of error, it allows you to answer the question, what's the chance that the person who's leading really is ahead, has more than 50% of the voters? And it turns out that we can do that using the sampling theory. In this particular case, we had 6,831 participants in the 8 polls that were pooled together. 3354 for Trump, 3231 for Harris. The few hundred elsewhere we'll set aside. They voted for Stein or something, effectively abstained. So it was basically 51 to 49 for Trump. If we actually go, come on, next one, please. If we actually go through the use of sampling theory, it says that given the large sample size, the probability that this result indicates that Trump is ahead is 94%. Each poll is small, the margin is little, but again and again and again, when it happens so many times in a row, the cumulative effect is in fact substantial. Obviously, this assumes that the only error we're dealing with is random polling errors associated with the luck of the draw. In real life, of course, the polls could be fail for many reasons, as we know. But I'm saying if you take the polls seriously, this is evidence that Trump is ahead in Arizona. I did the same thing, the next slide. For all 7 of the states that are considered swing states, and basically people, and never mind what I prefer or what you prefer, in every one of the 7 states, Trump emerged as ahead by at least a 2-to-1 margin in terms of the probability of having more than half of the relevant electorate. In fact, I was so surprised that as I went from Arizona to Georgia, Michigan, it's like looking at the same set of numbers again and again and again. It's a little bit for you New Yorkers. Remember Radio City? I don't know whether the Rockettes are still dancing there. It was almost like the Rockettes. All of the legs were being kicked up in the same way in the 7 states. Well, all 7 states, it seemed that based on the recent polling results, that Trump is ahead. What about the overall chance that he'd win enough of these states so as to win in the Electoral College? If we go to the next slide, let me tell you what happens. He really needs, roughly speaking, only 4 out of 7 of those to win in the Electoral College. There's one exception to that, but I don't want to get into the technicalities of electoral votes now. But if you put everything together, those results imply the chance he would win the presidency in 2 weeks, approximately 96%. Okay? Now, that's assuming that the way people vote on November 5th is the same as the way they say they intend to vote on October 19th. But I'm saying if you look at the raw numbers themselves, basically they do suggest under RCP that Trump has slowly but surely accumulated a lead that means you have to say the data favor him. By the way, so let's continue a little bit with this. We see very different results, of course. Namely, we have a very close election under Silver Bulletin. We have anything but a close election under Real Clear Politics. Okay? First of all, what about the 2% deficit? What if that happens again? And I just reran the analysis, and it turns out for Silver Bulletin, Trump's chance of winning goes up from 51 to 69, whereas for RCP, where it was already 96, it goes up to 99. Okay? I was surprised that Silver Bulletin only went up to 69 because if you add 2 points to Trump's vote share, if he's ahead by 1, and you add 2, now he's ahead by 3. But what's really happening is that Nate Silver doesn't care so much about the precise polling results. He's considering historical patterns. He's considering correlations across states and economic variables and whatnot. So that's why, even when the polls change in a way that seems to benefit Trump, in the overall effect of the chance of winning, it's somewhat less than you might think. So RCP is very much dominated by polls exclusively. Silver Bulletin considers a lot of other things. If we can go on, let's talk about how we would consider. Now, I'll show you how hip I am. IMHO, okay? First of all, as this business about being 2 points too low and trying to correct for it, I think let's just forget about it. They've made attempts to deal with it. My guess is the attempts will largely succeed. If anything, the worry is that they'll overcompensate and keep on kicking up Trump's vote share in their calculations more than actually should be done. That's why it's helpful that not all pollsters are doing this, okay? But I think the real issue is what do we make of the fact that you had 51.2% from Silver Bulletin and 96% from Real Clear Politics? Okay, if we can continue, I will look back at the Arizona data, and in particular, is there any reason I think these data and the corresponding data in the 6 other swing states are artificially favorable to Trump? And I noticed a few things. First of all, as I mentioned before, the consistency of the results at different times and at different methodologies works against the idea that the whole enterprise is erratic and unreliable. If you try to average several numbers together in statistics, if the numbers go all over the place, you don't really trust the average. But when all the numbers themselves are very similar, then you do have much greater faith in the average. Another issue is, what if it were the case that the first week in a 2-week period, Trump is ahead by 5, the second week, Harris is ahead by 5, and then the average is that they're tied? You might say, well, that's superficial because it ignores the time trend away from Trump. So I said, is there perhaps a time trend away from Trump in the data, which means that using the overall average is artificially favorable to him? Well, I didn't find any evidence of that. And indeed, if you simply skim these numbers, if anything, if there's any time trend within these few weeks, it's in favor of Trump rather than against him. I did not consider any such Trump favorable to Trump trend in the calculations I showed you. I'm just saying when I looked over these things, and you can look over them, and I hope you will get access to the slides and be able to write an email to me if you want to talk about them. If you can find a way of interpreting these numbers as less favorable to Trump than the average, I'd like to hear it because I couldn't see it there. Anyway, if we continue, okay, what I tried to do is to say, I looked at everything. I think Real Clear Politics has to be taken seriously. First of all, in any given swing state, the polls were highly consistent. Secondly, there was no trend within the data within the few weeks away from Trump, which would suggest the overall average is artificially favorable to him. The same pattern arose in all 7 swing states, different pollsters, different polls. Somehow the same result came up. And fourthly, very importantly, next one, please, that Real Clear Politics did just as well as 538. In other words, I don't think we should just throw RCP aside because its result is more dramatic. It seems to me that the raw information that led to that result makes us believe that the result has to be taken seriously. Okay, so then what? I'm almost finished with what I would say. Having said that, look, Silver Bulletin is so much more exhaustive than RCP, so much more brought together by people who really have tried very hard to understand what's going on and to incorporate it in the analysis, that I would have to give more weight to Silver Bulletin than to the RCP numbers. But how much more? Well, if I considered them both equally valid, I would give 50-50 weight to each. However, I said maybe 3-1 in favor of Silver Bulletin, meaning that the Real Clear Politics deserves some weight, but not as much as the much more systematic analysis. If you go through that, again, the 3-1 is just a rough estimate of the weight rate, whether it should be 4-1 or 2.7-1, just a rule. Here's my approximation that as of last Saturday at noon, the best estimate at that point of the chance of a Trump victory on November 5th is about 62%. In other words, much closer to the 51 than the 96, but not ignoring the 96. And that's where I think we stand now, namely that the data at hand do point somewhat in the direction of a Trump victory on November 5th. Now, look, there are inevitable caveats, and if we were to go through them extensively, we would be here at dinner time. One thing is, what would a Harris supporter say now about this? I can tell you because I've read it. The people will say, well, you're losing things that are important in this kind of calculation. First of all, we got a better ground game. And we have people knocking on doors, calling up, sending messages, bringing people to the polls, and you don't include that. That's one. Secondly, we have more money for spend on advertising, and we have much Michelle Obama. So you don't consider these advantages, and they are going to matter on the polling day. All right, fine. I respect these concerns. However, let's remember, though, the polling results now to somewhat reflect those phenomena. If you're getting a lot more ads on the television for Harris than for Trump, then the people who answer the polls have seen more of these, and this has influenced them to some extent. As far as Michelle Obama, well, they've seen Michelle Obama at the convention, and to the extent that she does lead some people toward the Democrats, and that may well be the case, many of them are already there. Sort of it's baked into the calculations at this point, et cetera. And so, in other words, you can't say that the polls now don't reflect the phenomena that they believe will be advantageous on November 5th. They may not reflect them enough. How do you reflect the ground game getting out the vote on November 5th? That's going to be hard. However, if anyone has done it properly, it would be Nate Silver in Silver Bulletin. Okay? It's also true that polls not only describe what's happening, but they can shape what's happening. If people who are unnerved by the prospect of a Trump victory now in the last 2 weeks exert greater efforts because of the results at this point, then that itself might change the final result, right? So, of course, the opposite can also happen. The Trump people can say, we had better do more lest we lose this little advantage that we have now. But it is certainly true that things can happen in the last 2 weeks, such that what looks like a clear pattern 2 weeks before doesn't correspond to what actually happened. In 2016, arguably the last minute notice from the FBI that it was looking at Hillary Clinton's emails again, that might have been an example of a last minute development that moved a few votes. We can't predict what might happen in the next 2 weeks. So I'm not saying there's an inevitability about that. I do think, though, realistically, we should say that the numbers are moving a certain way. You know, was it Bob Dylan who said, you don't have to be a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing? I think it's fair to say, ladies and gentlemen, that the wind at the moment is blowing in the direction of a victory for Donald Trump. And in a few moments, I'll be happy to start answering your questions. But one last thing before we turn to that, and that is that Peggy Noonan writes an excellent column in the Wall Street Journal, and she's saying, you know, we're all very intense and nervous now about the election that's coming, and it's just not a time where we feel great. And I think there clearly is some truth about that. But maybe, may I suggest to the alumni, maybe we should step back for a moment from the immediate issues of the election. I remember Dean Lester Thoreau, Dean Thoreau, the late Dean Thoreau, who was a great dean of the Sloan School. And he was once asked by a Japanese businessman. The businessman said, you know, I am just a cipher in the life of my company. It will be around 5,000 years. But what about America? Is there anything in America that's going to be around in 5,000 years? And Dean Thoreau, who's always very sharp, answered, MIT. MIT will be around. And then he led the crowd in a rousing toast to MIT 5,000 years from now. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, the happy news is that partly because of all of your contributions to the school, to the world, etc., the Sloan School is an inextricable part of MIT. It's extremely important in terms of the interface between MIT and the rest of the world. God knows how many corporations were formed by people who got entrepreneurial training at places like Sloan. So if MIT is going to be around 5,000 years from now, you can bet the Sloan School will be around triumphantly 5,000 years from now. So why don't we take a moment away from the present crisis and just quietly have a little bit of a toast to MIT Sloan 5,000 years from now. Anyway, having relaxed with it, why don't we return to the current situation? And I'm happy to answer your questions. I thank you all for being here and thank, of course, the people who arranged for the hosting.
Arnie, thank you so much for going into that level of detail and providing such a thoughtful analysis. It's fascinating. Thank you. So Arnie and I have prepared a few questions in advance, but as he mentioned, we welcome your comments as well, and we'll be fielding those questions. But to start, as you noted in the beginning and throughout the presentation, the U.S. Presidential election process is unique. So could you speak to, for a moment, about the nature of that system, and does it have an impact on election outcomes?
Well, it's certainly true it's unique. And believe me, when you try to explain it, as I did to my French student, you know, Arnaud, believe me, it was a bit unique because he was thinking, and this, and this. As you know, each state has a number of electoral votes, which is equal to its number of senators, which is 2, plus the number of representatives in the House of Representatives. And in almost all states, they go winner take all. So, for example, here in Massachusetts, we have 11 electoral votes. The candidate who gets the majority of votes, whether it be Trump or it be Harris, will get all 11. And it's necessary to get a total of 270 over the 50 states, actually including the 51, including the District of Columbia. You have to have at least 270 to win. At the moment, both Trump and Harris have about 220 apiece, roughly speaking. And the question is, who's going to make it up the rest of the way to 270? That's what's going to happen in the 7 swing states, okay? And if Trump can get a majority of those electoral votes out of the 7 states, he will be the winner. Okay, so that's basically, in a very quick description, where we are and how things stand.
Thank you very much for taking the time to go through that. So the polling results, as you mentioned, they're pretty consistent throughout this election season. But do they impact election outcomes or help to sway voter activity?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think the answer has to be yes, in that people have watched this presentation. I'm grateful for all of you for your patience in listening. Some people may, based on what they saw, decide to change what they will do relative to the election between now and then. Some, for example, who favor Harris, and I'm not talking about who, it doesn't matter who I favor or you favor. I'm just saying, let who favor Harris saying, oh my God, she's falling behind. What can I do that I haven't done yet? And they may do something, and the consequence, if enough people feel that way, can be to change the results. In other words, the polls not only describe the results, but they can change them. At the same time, as I said, it could be those who support Trump looking at these results might say, well, the other side's really going to work harder now. We have to work harder also. So the answer is yes. I think the polling results certainly can influence what happens between now and then. It will also influence how the candidates conduct themselves in the next 2 weeks, what themes they will focus on, for example, based upon what they sense is the reason the electorate is going the way it is. So I very much can imagine that things can change.
Absolutely, I agree. So, given that you mentioned that there are various methodologies for polling, and you highlighted a few in your presentation, but how would you recommend that we can be smart consumers of information, or how should we best interpret the results that we see on our own time?
Well, I think there's nothing wrong with going to the website, and I don't get paid for saying this. You can go to the website Silver Bulletin every day and get the latest estimate of the odds of a Trump victory or a Harris victory, and lots of commentary. And I read it every day. I'm actually a subscriber, so I get to see other numbers. You don't really know exactly what 538 does. It's a little bit like the Coca-Cola formula. They won't tell us exactly how they put things together. But I would go to that. I myself go to Real Clear Politics every day and look at the polling results. They also have the betting odds, the people who are betting money on who will win and watching how they are betting. Don't forget they're putting money on the line, so they try very hard to be accurate. At the moment, those odds are about 60-40 in favor of Trump, the latest odds. So I would say going to some of those websites in the morning, spending just a few minutes and getting a sense of the state of the race is something we can all do in addition to brushing our teeth.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, you bring up an interesting point about the betting sites, and we did receive a question from an audience member in that regard. Do you think that the betting sites are worse or better than the polls at predicting the outcome of the election?
Well, it's a little complicated because in the United States, it's apparently not legal to bet on the presidential election. So the people who are betting are very often people who are not Americans. They're betting from the UK, for example. And the question is, well, how much do they really understand about the US? And it may be they understand even more than we do about the US, but I'm just saying it's not self-evidently clear. There have been books that have talked about the wisdom of crowds that say when you get a consensus in something like a betting parlor, that it tends to do remarkably well in describing what's going on, that the extreme votes of one side and the other tend to cancel out, and you do come up with a pretty good idea of where you should be. However, in terms of American presidential elections, I don't even know. And even if we could look at how well they did, let's say in 2020 or 1988, there's the question, how relevant is that to what's happening now in 2024? In other words, how much is the past prologue? So I don't know. I take the results of the betting parlors seriously, but I would take more seriously the results of the polls.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to continue in this theme and take questions from the audience. And one we received in advance of today's discussion, you've talked about briefly in your presentation. I'd just like to go into that in a little bit more detail. Could you talk about the correlation between states and the upcoming election and how we should best interpret the polls, given that information?
Well, one of the points that's made by Nate Silver is that we can expect correlations. Back in 2016, in the election that Trump won against Hillary Clinton, as soon as it was clear that Trump was doing better than expected in Pennsylvania, the people on the air, the commentators said, I bet he's going to do better than expected in Wisconsin and Michigan, which is what happened because they tend to go the same way. So once you hear how one of them is going, it's a tip off for the others. So many models, including some that I had used actually in analyzing the results of 2020, do allow for such correlations. In this particular election, I suspect these correlations don't matter so much because you're talking about states in every one of the swing states. It's a very, very close race. And when it's so close, I'm not sure that telling me that, let's say, that Harris prevailed in Pennsylvania increases the chance that Harris prevailed in Michigan because the states are similar, but they're not identical. To give one example, and again, just to give an example, not to take a position on a controversy, uh, Michigan has a higher Muslim population around Dearborn, for example, and they take a certain view of what's been happening in the Middle East and the war in Gaza and Hezbollah. In Pennsylvania, which is nearby, you have a higher than usual concentration of Jewish voters who might take a different position on what's happening there. So even though the states in general have tended to behave the same way, there may be special stresses now that create differences between the states. So simply assuming that historical correlations will continue to work may be an oversimplification. So I think our best guess is simply to treat the states as essentially independent. By the way, the only way of the 7 states that I mentioned that Harris could prevail with only 3 of them would be to win the 3 Midwestern states, namely Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And if all 3 of them went the same way for her, she would make it up to 270, even if Trump won the other 4. And that might happen. However, I must tell you that Nate Silver right now estimates that if the 3 states are going to go the same way, they're all going to go for Trump. Okay? In other words, if there is a correlation in this case, it is not a correlation that in itself necessarily benefits Kamala Harris. Okay? But I myself don't think that the correlations are going to be strong in processing the data now.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And actually, I think I'd like to build upon your comments about the swing states because we received a question along those lines from an audience member. What is the criteria that goes into selecting swing states? So, for example, this person is from Florida, and Florida was considered a swing state for years, but now it is not considered one. Could you speak to that?
Well, I guess a state is a swing state until it isn't. You're right. Florida was the classic swing state. And for those of us who are old enough, well, even the alumni are old enough to remember 2000, remember how the election, the issue of hanging chads in Palm Beach was the determinant of whether George W. Bush or Al Gore would be the president. But there are changes. And there has been a change in the electorate in Florida in a direction that has made it more conservative. So I think people believe, and reasonably so, that now it is not a swing state. However, in analyzing data for the forthcoming election, no one is saying you don't gather data in Florida. Believe me, we could go to RCP and find out what's happened in the polls in Florida. And what's happened is in Florida, Trump is ahead by, let's say, 6, 7 percentage points. And given the numbers of thousands of data points involved, that would imply a probability of winning of close to 100%. So in other words, you don't throw them out. But when you actually apply the formulas to them, for all states except those 7, it's pretty much a done deal who's going to win. Not Wisconsin, Minnesota's a state where there is a chance that Trump will win it. But if you actually look at it, he's behind by maybe 5 points. But again, given the sizes of the samples, that only implies a chance of winning less than 1 in 100. So in other words, the reason these 7 are the swing states is that when you look at the data for all 51 states, you find that only for these 7 is there even a reasonable chance that both candidates could win. Otherwise, it's basically a shutout of one or the other.
Okay, so I want to build upon that a little bit because we also received another interesting question along these lines. So given that the polls are so close, and it does appear that many states are already decided, and as you highlighted, the percentage of undecided voters is incredibly small and much more so than what is typical. Is turnout a major factor? And if so, how do the polls assess and account for potential changes in turnout?
This is an excellent question, and You know, how do they take into account turnout and basically get out the vote drives and things like that? There is the notion of likely voter. If you look carefully at what we wrote for Real Clear Politics, and the pollsters try to say, is this person really going to go to the polls? And part of that is based upon the person's voting history. If it's a
Mhm.
person who's never voted and doesn't seem particularly interested in voting, they may say this is not a likely voter. However, the likelihood of voting also depends on how easy it is to get to the polls. So if you're elderly and you're in an area where someone's going to come to your door and say, I'll drive you to the polls, you're more likely to vote than if there is no such person. So the question then is, what about these last minute get out the vote drives and how effective are they? And I don't know to what extent the analyses of someone like Nate Silver take that into account. My guess is they try. You can rest assured that Nate Silver's thought of this, and he's thinking about what could we do that might tell us something about that. And this is part of the general notion that at the moment, Kamala Harris has more money. And that's why they have more ads and various other things, including the ground game on on election day itself. So he might say, well, if this extra money is getting this result in terms of the advertisements, what might it imply about what's happening on the get out the vote drive, the ground game on election day? I don't know exactly how he's doing it. As I said, it's the Coca-Cola formula. I do believe he's taking it into account, and that's part of the reason why his assessment is so much more guarded than is that of Real Clear Politics, I think. But I don't know exactly. The answer is, have they taken it into account well enough? I don't know.
Well, thank you very much for just going into that detail. Very thoughtful. So going back to something we've discussed kind of throughout the presentation, as you highlighted that one of the factors that potentially could have contributed to the polls being inaccurate in the past is that Trump supporters were underrepresented. Um, Now that the kind of the polls are accounting for that, is it possible that Harris may be underestimated in the same way, or are there other kind of systematic errors that may be coming into play in the results that we see so far?
Well, you say, is it possible? I think the answer is, oh, sure, it's possible. It is possible now that they're so worried about underestimating Trump's vote share that they're giving him votes he doesn't really have. You know, when I described to you that method where they match the results to what percentage voted for Trump in 2020, the effect of these maneuvers is to kick up Trump's vote share. In other words, he might get 42% in your actual respondents, and you treat it as a 46. So they're already engaged in certain maneuvers. The temptation is to wonder whether some of them are mischief, and they may benefit Trump. They may artificially benefit Trump in terms of making him seem more popular than he is. It's possible it goes the other way also, that there is a possibility that people who are favoring Harris are less willing to tell that to pollsters than actually people who favor Trump. See, in the old days, there was the notion of the shy Trump voter, namely someone who favored Trump, but basically was a little ashamed to tell the pollster that because Trump in some states, you know, is not a popular figure. And it's not just people oppose him; they abhor him. And so people were hesitant to say that. However, the data didn't necessarily show that up because you saw that to the extent that they underestimated Trump's vote share, the underestimation was actually bigger in the states where Trump was incredibly popular, like Wyoming. So you see, you always have to go back to the data to say, here's a conjecture about what's going on. Are the numbers consistent with it? And at this point, I don't know, could there be biases one way or the other? The answer is certainly we can imagine lots of reasons there could be. And I don't know that we have any way of resolving it. What I would say, though, going back to a general point, is that Real Clear Politics, simplistic though it seems, nonetheless did very, very well in 2020. It did just as well as the behemoth, okay, as the tortoise caught up with the hare, you could say. And for that reason, I think we should see what the tortoise is saying as one of the components of thinking about what's happening now.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you. So one other interesting question that came through is about generations X, Y, and Z. If they are inspired to vote, possibly because of the influences of celebrities and personalities such as, Taylor Swift or Lizzo, do you think this has been factored into our polling results that you see today?
It certainly, in theory, has been factored in because the pollsters very much worry about how the age distribution of those who responded to the poll corresponds to the age distributions of all voters. And you're right, the generations, I don't know, now you say X, Y, Z, I don't know how many letters we have to solve for. It's like an algebra game with all of these generations. They are supposedly considered, but the question that comes up is how many of them will go to the polls, you see? And there is some uncertainty. Some of them are said to be cynical, saying nothing's going to change. It doesn't matter who wins, and they may not go to the polls. On the other hand, you're going to have a drive this coming week, for example, with President Obama and Michelle Obama going around the country. Maybe they could inspire some of these people to go to the polls after all, et cetera. So I think people are very much concerned about what happens here. The numbers that I've shown you do take into account what they have learned in the polls about people in these age ranges.
Okay. Thank you very much.
But I
So
don't
we
know.
have
They
another.
talk. I'm sorry, but they talk about what is it, TikTok or something? These things that
Mhm.
someone at my advanced age doesn't know much about, but influencers and whatnot are affecting what's happening in these generations. And yeah, there may be something to that, and it may be hard for the polls really to pick up on that. And it could be when we
Mhm.
do a postmortem after the election, we see that that was one of the weaknesses. I can only say that I can't imagine that Nate Silver has not thought about that and tried to correct for it, and probably done so about as well as it can be done. That's my
Mhm.
first assessment.
Thank you. So we have another question that is in regards to, the fact that, polling may be inaccurate because people aren't always willing to share or honestly self-report, and that there is, of course, a limited choice of candidates. So the question is, could we use tools like Benford's Law on voting totals? And could we apply Benford's Law to a different data set, such as voting timestamps? And would this help to detect if votes were added or removed improperly, offering a more secure method to ensure election integrity and to reduce false claims about fraud?
That's an easy question for me to answer. Namely, I don't know. I'm sorry. I know that some people are very concerned about election fraud. Others say it's almost non-existent. Of course, it's a funny thing about fraud. If people get away with it, you don't, by definition, you don't know that it happened. So I don't know whether there's any evidence for an appreciable amount of election fraud, but I don't know how one would use timestamps and whatnot to reduce it. I'm sure people are thinking about it, but I have nothing that I can usefully add.
And then I guess one final question before we wrap up, because we have only a few minutes left, that just came through. So as you had mentioned, early voting figures are reportedly setting records. And are there any statistical reasons to think that greater turnout favors one candidate over the other?
Well, I think it depends on where the turnout is. Okay. And yeah, and we do know that. For example, we know which districts, we know something about the ethnicity, for example, of the people living in particular districts would be, and other information about their income distribution and whatnot. So you could say they offer clues, but it's unclear because if more people in a particular group show up early, then by definition, fewer of them will show up on election day itself because they've already voted, et cetera, assuming we don't have corruption, of course. So I do think people very much try to come up with assessments. I know I just read yesterday 15 million people have already voted in the United States, in various states. There are worries that in North Carolina, because of the terrible floods, that it will be harder for some people to make it to the polls. And they're trying to come up with alternative arrangements so that these people can vote. So, yeah, there are all kinds of things like this might represent useful information about what's going to happen. However, frankly, I would think a polling result which attempts to look at the whole electorate is going to be more revealing than something about the minority who voted early, because we don't know how those who voted early compare to the full electorate.
That's a very fair point. Thank you. This has been just absolutely fascinating and insightful. Arnie, thank you so much for just taking the time to go into such detail about a very important topic. And I think from the activity of our audience members today, they have enthusiastically enjoyed the session. So thank you very much. And I'll just turn it over to Greg for a few final thoughts.
Well, if I can say one more thing,
Sure,
and
please.
that is that I know people have questions, etc., and we have not been able to go through them. If they will send them to me as an email at abarnett@mit.edu, I'll try to go through the questions and get back to people to answer them, because I know that a lot of people have strong reactions one way or the other and want to talk about it. And I'm happy to talk. I'm always happy to talk to the alumni because they're so important to us.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Arnie. Thank you, Jackie. Arnie, we received so many comments from alumni who shared memories of being a student of yours. So we're just really grateful that you could open your classroom to us online today. So we
Oh,
do want to thank.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And we do want to thank all of our alumni who tuned in today, and we appreciate you spending part of your afternoon with us. I think a wonderful way to close is to echo Professor Barnett's quote, "Cheers to MIT today, and cheers to MIT 5,000 years in the future." So thank you all.